At 09:42 on July 14, 1944, Mispa stopped being a B-17 and turned into a wind-torn shell full of men. A second earlier, she'd been just another flying fortress in a 60-ship box from the 483rd Bomb Group, engines droning through black flak over Budapest. Then an 88mm shell came in through the front, like the finger of God. The explosion was instant and total. Everything forward of the cockpit simply vanished. First, Lieutenant Evald Swanson saw it as a flash, then a white wall of concussion. One moment he had a nose, a Norden bomb sight, a bombardier, a navigator, and an instrument panel. The next, the world in front of him was a screaming hole. The floor dropped away. Arctic air at 30,000 feet punched through the cavity with the sound of a freight train. The temperature outside was 40 below zero. The blast ripped at his flight suit, slapped the breath out of his lungs. Where the co-pilot's side panel and forward bulkhead had been, there was now open sky and tumbling shards of metal. He could see the city of Budapest far below through the gap, and beyond it, the Danube like a strip of dull silver. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley, the bombardier, and Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson, the navigator, had been sitting directly in the blast. They were gone. No bodies, no movement, just blood and bits of cloth smeared across twisted metal edges where their compartment had been. The cockpit itself jolted backward. With all that weight torn from the nose, Mispa's center of gravity snapped aft. The tail was now heavy, the front terrifyingly light. The bomber pitched up hard. Swanson felt his harness bite into his shoulders as the nose clawed at the sky. In an instant, the world outside the new window was nothing but blue-white emptiness. The horizon disappeared below them. The airframe shuddered as the angle of attack climbed toward stall. He reached for the control column, out of pure reflex, and grabbed at nothing. The yoke, the column, the entire control stand had been mounted to forward structure that no longer existed. In the blast, it had gone out the front with the instrument panel and the two men. There was nothing in front of him but empty air and whipping cables. No column, no instruments, no airspeed, no altimeter, no artificial horizon. To his right, co-pilot Paul Berndt was still there, hanging in his harness, eyes wide and blood spattered across his goggles. For a half-second, Swanson's brain tried to tell him the same thing every other pilot's training would. You've lost controls. You're done. Then he heard another sound under the roar of the torn slipstream. The thin, metallic twang of steel cables under tension. The control cables that ran from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the tail and wings had been routed low and aft. The blast had stripped the cockpit around them, but the runs themselves were still there, exposed now, whipping in the wind, but intact. 4 thick cable bundles arced through the open front of the cockpit, leading back into the darkness of the fuselage. Elevator, ailerons, rudder. "Cables!" someone screamed behind him. Maybe the flight engineer, maybe the top turret gunner clambering down. "The cables are still there!" Mispa was going nose-high, engines still at power, seconds away from a stall that would flip her onto her back and send 9 men into a spin over enemy territory. Swanson didn't have a column. What he had were bare steel tendons hanging in the slipstream. He unhooked one glove with his teeth, lunged forward into the howling cold, and grabbed a bundle of cable with his bare hand. They cut into his palm like saws. "Pull!" he yelled through frozen lips. "Somebody get the other side, and pull!" The B-17 was about to fall out of the sky with no nose, no instruments, and no conventional controls. The only thing standing between 10 men and a fireball over Budapest was the idea that you might be able to fly a 4-engine bomber by hand, with nothing but raw cable and pain. And they had about 10 seconds to find out if that was even possible. Evald Swanson hadn't grown up dreaming about flying a crippled fortress by its nerves. He'd grown up in a place where winter came early and stayed late, on a farm outside Duluth, Minnesota. Snowfields, frozen ponds, and wide skies. His first sense of danger in the air had been watching his father read weather reports before taking a truck across icy roads, learning to respect conditions you couldn't see, but that could kill you. When war came, he found himself in the U.S. Army Air Forces, a quiet, serious young man who took naturally to instruments and checklists. He wasn't the loudest in the barracks, but he rarely busted a pattern or blew a procedure. In the multi-engine schoolhouse, instructors trusted him with the hard students because he stayed calm when others panicked. In B-17 transition, he learned the Fortress as an integrated system: 4 Wright Cyclone R-1820 engines, hydraulic systems, oxygen, electrics, control runs, how all of it tied together. He absorbed the emergency procedures: loss of 1 engine, loss of 2, feathering props, hydraulic failures, even the rare scenario of partial control failure. No manual had a chapter titled, "What to Do When the Entire Nose is Torn Off at 30,000 Feet." By 1944, the 8th Air Force over England got most of the headlines, but the 15th Air Force out of Italy was running its own private war from dusty strips along the Adriatic. The 483rd Bomb Group's base at Sterparone was a world of heat, dust devils, and the constant rumble of engines. The men lived in tents and flew over some of the most heavily defended targets still left in German hands: Vienna, Ploiești, Munich, and today, Budapest. On the morning of July the 14th, Mispa sat at the end of Sterparone's runway, with engines turning over at 200 RPM, vibrating like a living thing. Ground crews had chalked her name, Mispa, under the cockpit window in crude white. Letters months earlier. She was a B-17G, late model, with a chin turret under the nose and twin 50s in almost every direction. Swanson ran his hands over the throttles and listened to each engine's note as he advanced the power for run-up. Cylinders caught, hesitated, then settled into the throaty, slightly uneven rumble that every Fortress driver knew by feel. He glanced over at Bernd, his co-pilot. Younger, narrower face, almost boyish under the helmet. Behind them, he could hear the interphone chatter as the rest of the crew settled in. Top turret flight engineer, Staff Sergeant Mike Carter, checking pressures and temps. Radio operator, Sergeant Frank Red Malloy, testing his set. Waist gunners cracking jokes as they stowed extra ammo cans. Tail gunner, Sergeant Jim Ortega, already alone at the far end of the ship, looking out at the empty Italian sky behind them. Up front in the nose, Dudley and Henderson worked over maps, switches, and the Norden. The bombardier checked his toggles. The navigator measured winds aloft. They all knew the statistics. You couldn't avoid them. Out of every 10 men who started a 15th Air Force tour, only 2, on average, made it through unscathed. Some would go down in flames. Some would bail out and spend the rest of the war in stalags, or in the tender care of the Gestapo. Some would vanish over the Balkans or the Adriatic, missing in action, on a line in a telegram. Still, they did what crews do before takeoff. They pretended the numbers applied to someone else. Swanson's world narrowed to checklists and engine noise. Mixture, props, mags. Flight controls, then still present, moving smoothly as he tested them. Instruments, green arcs across all 4 engines, vacuum solid, hydraulic pressure up. The briefing that morning had been blunt. Budapest's Shell oil refinery and its marshalling yards were a critical artery feeding the Eastern Front. Fuel and rail cars that stopped there went on to panzer divisions facing the Red Army. German and Hungarian flak units knew it. The Luftwaffe knew it. Intelligence estimated more than 280 and 100 mm guns ringed the target area, with lighter weapons filling the gaps. Budapest wasn't just any city. It was a fortress ringed with steel sky. Mines. "Stay in tight formation," the group operations officer had said, pointer tapping the white chalk diagram of a combat box. "You leave the box, you die alone. Bomb on the lead. Get your bombs on target, then get out. Budapest will try to keep you." Now, climbing out over the Adriatic, Mispa slid into her slot in the formation. 60 fortresses stepped up and staggered left and right, sunlight flashing off silver skins and dark olive drab patches. White contrails painted the blue behind them as they crossed the Yugoslav coast. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, waited the stacked black clouds of flak. In the left seat, Swanson flexed his gloved hands on the yoke, then still there, and felt that familiar chill at the base of his neck that said, today's mission wasn't just another line in a logbook. He checked his watch. If everything went as briefed, they'd be over the initial point by 09:35. Turn on the bomb run. 2 tons of high explosive out of Mispa's bay. Turn, rally, head for home. If. The engines droned. The formation tightened. The men checked guns, adjusted oxygen masks, and waited for Budapest to appear in the front windows like the mouth of a gun. The first sign was the black smudges on the horizon. At 09:25, the lead navigator called the initial point. The entire 60-ship formation began a slow, stately turn, lining its long, staggered shape up with the target, the Shell oil refinery and the spiderweb of railway yards in the heart of Budapest. Below them, the Danube cut the city in two, a silver blade through a knot of streets, factories, and siding yards. At 25,000 feet, the air was thin and brutally cold. Vapor streamed from engine cowlings. Inside Mispa, everyone was on oxygen. Ice crystals formed on the edges of the cockpit glass. Then the flak started to rise. Far ahead, they saw the first blossoms, small black puffs at first, then more, then whole dirty clouds that seemed to hang in the air ahead of the bombers. The men called it ack-ack, heavy stuff, mailboxes, all the slang they could throw at something that was trying to kill them. Intelligence had been right. The Luftwaffe and Hungarian air defense had massed everything they had around the rail yards. Batteries of 88s and heavier guns ringed the city. They didn't have to shoot down every bomber. They just had to kill enough to make the mission fail. Swanson tightened his grip on the yoke and kept Mispa welded in formation. Breaking out, jinking, might feel safer, but it made you a lone target and ruined the bomb run. Shells burst around them with a noise like someone slamming a steel door inside your skull. Each black puff was a radius of razor-sharp fragments. Aluminum skin might as well have been paper. Mispa took her first hit in the tail. A dull clang and a thump. Then the interphone crackled with Ortega's voice, high and tight. "Tails hold, but I'm still here." Moments later, more impacts along the wings, holes punched through outboard panels, a fuel tank nicked but not ignited, a blackout of one wingtip light. The airplane shivered with eke, which hit but stayed in position. In the nose, Dudley lay over the Norden, eye to the sight. Henderson fed him heading and drift numbers. They were seconds from bombs away. "Steady, steady," Swanson murmured, more to himself than anyone else. The temptation to duck, to flinch as black flowers blossomed all around, was almost physical. Ahead, a fortress in the high element took a direct hit under the wing. The left wing folded at the root as if hinged. The bomber rolled over, shedding engines and parts, and went down in a tumble of fire. 3 parachutes blossomed. Then they disappeared behind the stacked layers of smoke and city haze. "Bomb bay doors open," Carter reported. The deep, familiar rumble changed as Mispa's big doors split the belly and added drag. The entire formation was now flying into a solid wall of coordinated fire. You could taste the cordite through your oxygen mask, or maybe that was just imagination and fear. "Bombs! Away!" Dudley called. Relief shuddered through the airframe as 2 tons of bombs dropped, the fortress lurching up slightly as the weight left her. Tiny dark specks fell away below, then merged into nothing. There was no time to watch for impacts. Swanson was just easing pressure on the yoke, starting to think about the rally turn, when the 88 shell hit the nose. He never saw it. No one did. One moment Dudley and Henderson existed. The next there was white light and the shriek of torn metal. From behind, Carter saw the entire front of the airplane disappear in a blossom of smoke and fragments that blew straight back into the cockpit. He threw an arm up on instinct. Something hot and sharp slashed across his sleeve. Up front, the world blew inward around Swanson and burnt. Plexiglass shards, pieces of structural members, maps, blood, human fragments, all driven back in a wave that smashed into their helmets and goggles. Then silence inside the roar. Where there had been green-painted aluminum and instruments, there was now jagged wreckage and an obscene open cavity shoving raw sky into the cockpit. The yoke and column went with the blast. So did the main instrument panel. Even the glare shield was gone. Mispa reared like a spooked horse. With the forward mass replaced by open air, the tail's weight snapped the nose upward. Engines at power, wings still producing lift, she pitched toward a stall as if trying to leap away from the blast that had gutted her. Outside, other bombers in the formation watched in horror as Mispa's nose disintegrated. And then, somehow, the headless fortress kept moving with them, lurching, but not immediately falling. Inside, Swanson stared into the screaming blue hole where his cockpit had been and understood with sick clarity. He was now flying blind, damaged, and effectively unarmed in the heaviest flak of his life, with nothing between him and a 30,000-foot fall, but whatever control his bare hands could find. The first few seconds after the blast were pure survival instinct. The B-17's nose kept rearing, the angle steepening. Buffeting started along the wings, the first whisper of an impending stall. Swanson unlatched his harness reflexively to lean forward and nearly got blown out of the cockpit. Only a grip on the seat frame kept him from being sucked toward the gap. He clipped back in with numb fingers, lungs burning from the shock of the cold air. "Paul!" he shouted at Burnt. "Cables!" The co-pilot's eyes followed his pointing hand to the bundles of steel wire along the cockpit floor. With the front structure gone, the control cables lay exposed, thrumming in the gale. 3 main runs, 2 for the elevators, 2 for the ailerons, 1 for the rudder. Each set of paired cables pulled opposite directions, balanced by the big control surfaces out on the tail and wings. They were the bomber's tendons. If they were intact, maybe the beast could still be steered. Carter, the engineer, scrambled down from the top turret, fighting the icy blast. Blood trickled down one side of his face from a cut above his eyebrow. "What have we got?" he yelled. "No yoke, no panel," Swanson shouted back. "Cables only." Carter stared for a fraction of a second, then did what crew chiefs and mechanics do. He grabbed metal and made it work. Okay, these 2 are elevator," he said, hands on a pair of cables quivering just right of center. "You pull, nose goes down. I pull, nose goes up." "Take 'em," Swanson ordered. Carter wrapped the elevator cable bundle around his forearms, leaned back in the narrow space between the seats, and hauled with everything he had. The cables bit through his flying jacket and into muscle. For a tiny moment, nothing seemed to happen, just more buffeting, the wind trying to rip him forward. Then the nose dipped a fraction, not enough, but something. More. Swanson houted. Burnt lunged for the aileron cables on the left side. "I've got roll," he gasped. "Tell me which way." Swanson's view of the world had shrunk to the raw horizon framed by torn metal. He had no artificial horizon, no airspeed indicator, no altimeter in front of him. Sidewall au gauge survived for engine temps and pressures, but the flight instruments had gone out the front with the nose. He had 2 references, the smudged line of the far horizon and the way the airframe felt under his backside and hands. He glanced out through the ragged nose opening. The formation was sliding away above and to the left, maintaining altitude and course. Mispa was rising past them in a dangerous ballooning climb. "Get that nose down," he shouted. Carter dug his boots into the deck, leaned his back against a shattered frame, and pulled harder. Tendons stood out in his neck. The cables creaked and bit deeper. Slowly, reluctantly, the heavy tail began to settle. The nose eased from nearly vertical back toward something that looked like level. The buffeting eased a fraction. "Okay, that's it. That's it. Hold what you've got," Swanson called. He could feel the engines still at heavy power. He reached down to the throttles that remained on the center pedestal. Miraculously, that chunk of the cockpit structure still clung to its mounts, and pulled them back to cruise. Less thrust, less zoom. The wind screamed through the nose cavity. His hands ached with cold, even inside gloves that were now uselessly torn across the palms. Blood from small cuts on his face had already frozen into stiff streaks. Behind them, the rest of the crew clung to whatever they could. In the radio room, Malloy huddled over his set, trying to get a mayday out over the racket. In the waist, the gunner stared forward through the fuselage at a view no B-17 crewman was ever supposed to have. Straight up the airplane's innards, and right out where the nose had been. "Somebody check on the bomb bay doors," Swanson snapped. "If they're still open, we're dragging a barn door." A voice crackled back. "Doors closed, skipper. Doors are closed." He risked a glance down. Budapest's outskirts were slipping beneath them. Rail yards, factories, the dark, thin line of the river. Flak was still coming up, but the worst of the barrage seemed behind now. They had, by luck or instinct, already carried past the densest guns. The immediate crisis was holding the aircraft. The next was deciding whether they had any hope of getting it home. "Carter, can you hold that elevator tension?" The engineer grunted. "For a minute, sure. 10? I don't know. My arms are on fire." Swanson thought fast. He'd seen pulleys rigged in hangars to move engines. He'd watched ground crews improvise controls using rope when power systems failed. "Use your belts," he shouted. "Run a strap through the cable around the seat base. Get yourself a purchase." Carter nodded, teeth chattering. He eased a little cable slack, fed his own harness belt around the bundle and back to a seat leg, and cinched it until the leather creaked. He could then lean his weight against it instead of relying on arm strength alone. They jury-rigged the rudder cables similarly, giving Swanson at least crude yaw control by bracing his boots and shoulders again. Here's the improvised loops. Burnt, still on the aileron cables, learned quickly how much pull made a bank. Left 5 degrees? More? Okay, that's too much. Ease it, Swanson coached, feeling each motion transmitted through the airframe. They were flying the fortress like a giant marionette, each man hauling on a set of strings while the pilot called the dance. "Where are we?" Swanson yelled back toward the radio room. "Still over enemy territory," Malloy replied, voice thin but steady. "But we're pointed south-southwest. If we can keep her together 10 minutes, we'll be over countryside. Maybe Yugoslavia." 10 minutes. 10 minutes of bare cables, makeshift harnesses, and guesswork. With no airspeed indicator, Swanson flew by engine sound and the feel of the slipstream. Too slow and the tail would buffet again. Stall looming. Too fast, and the weakened structure might shake itself apart, or the men on the cables might not be able to hold trim. Every bump of turbulence threatened to yank the improvised system out of alignment. Every flak burst seemed to tug at the jagged nose opening, trying to twist them into a spin. "Hang on," he said more quietly now to no one in particular. "Just hang on. We only need 10 minutes." On the ground near the Shell refinery, Feldwebel Karl Weiss peered through his 10x80 flak binoculars and saw something he did not understand. Weiss commanded a German 8.8 cm flak battery attached to the Budapest defenses. He and his Hungarian crewmen had been firing since the first bombers appeared. Careful rangings, then full salvos into the prescribed barrage boxes. They'd watched one fortress fall apart cleanly under their fire, wings scissoring off. Another staggered away, trailing smoke. Now, as the formation clawed past the target and turned for home, he scanned for battle damage, any stragglers to finish. 3 boxes of bombers roared overhead, tighter now, holes apparent in the pattern where ships had gone down. Between 2 of them, slightly low and to the rear, he saw a 4th fortress behaving strangely. It was offline. A little below the rest, slightly nose-high, not quite keeping station. He swung his glasses toward it and froze. The aircraft had no nose. Where the glassed-in bombardier's station and cheek windows should have been, there was just a ragged hole from cockpit level forward, like someone had taken a giant bite out of the fuselage. He could see daylight through the bomber, see small figures moving behind the gap. "Got him, Himmel," he breathed. "Schauen Sie das an." His number 2, a Hungarian corporal, took the binoculars for a moment and swore softly in Magyar. Through the lenses, Weiss saw something else. The head and shoulders of the pilot and co-pilot, exposed inside the hole, strapped into their seats with nothing in front of them but air. And the bomber was still flying. "Is that?" the corporal began. Weiss didn't let him finish. Training took over. "Battery, new target," he snapped. "Bearing 170, elevation high, 1 headless veer mote, fire at will." The 8.8 cm gun swung, crews slamming shells into breaches, gunners tracking, but the formation had already passed the optimum firing window. The headless B-17 and its companions were moving fast, cutting across arcs now preset for the main bomber stream. A few bursts bloomed around the damaged machine. Shrapnel peppered its already torn forward fuselage, but nothing essential. Weiss lowered his binoculars as the strange bomber receded. He had seen B-17s come apart before. He had watched them burn and break and fall. He had never seen one continue defiantly forward after losing its entire nose. "Stir," he muttered. "Stubborn." In another flak position closer to the city center, a Hungarian gunner slammed the breech of his 88 closed and watched the same aircraft limp by. Later, in a cellar over thin soup and cigarettes, he tried to describe it to a friend. "It was like a ghost," he said, "like a headless horse, still running even after you cut it." Reports went up the chain. One fortress heavily damaged, possibly lost further along its route. No one on the German side expected that machine to make it out of Hungary, much less back across the Adriatic. From their perspective, the sky wrote its own verdict. A bomber with no front had no future. They didn't know that inside the Ghost, 3 men were bleeding into their gloves as they hauled on bare steel cables, buying minutes for a crippled B-17 with nothing but muscle, improvisation, and rage. Inside Mispa, time stretched and knotted. The first minute after the blast had been panic and improvisation. The next 9 were sustained torture. Carter's harness and seat rig clamped the elevator cables enough to keep the nose from rearing again, but any change in power or turbulence meant he had to adjust, muscles screaming. Bern's forearms shook as he kept light tension on the aileron cables, responding to Swanson's barked corrections. "Left. Little more. Hold it. Now right. Easy." They flew not by numbers, but by sensation. The airframe spoke to Swanson through vibration and pressure changes. A slight lightness in the seat meant they were on the edge of a stall. A heavy, pounding chop along the wings meant too much speed or gust loading. He worked the throttles by ear, pulling back until the engine's song dropped into a lower, safer note, then nudging them up when the tail felt mushy. Freezing air knifed in through the open front. At 40 below, exposed skin numbed in seconds. Swanson's cheeks and forehead burned, then went dead. His tears from the initial blast had frozen at the corners of his eyes. He forced himself to keep blinking, keep his gaze on the horizon. Someone, he never knew who, had shoved an extra scarf across his lower face at some point, and it snapped like a flag in the wind. His flight suit was soaked at the front with blood, some his, mostly not. The cockpit floor was slick where fragments and shock had thrown it. Behind them, Malloy managed to get a message out. "Mayday, Mayday. This is B-17 Mispa, 483rd Bomb Group. Heavy battle damage, nose destroyed, attempting to withdraw south." Whether anyone heard it through the cluttered channels of the 15th Air Force that morning, they never found out. In the waist, one of the gunners started praying aloud. Another kept up a running commentary to no one in particular, because if he stopped talking, he might hear the blood in his own ears. "Still flying? Still flying, you stubborn bitch? Come on, girl. Just a little more." Minutes oozed by. At around the 5-minute mark, they cleared the immediate flak belt. The concussions stopped. The sky ahead was strangely empty. Below, the dense cityscape gave way to patchworks of fields and smaller towns. "We're over countryside," Malloy reported. "Still enemy territory, but not Budapest." "Good," Swanson said through chattering teeth. "Keep an eye out. If we lose her, I want us falling over dirt, not stone." The question no one wanted to voice was where they were ultimately going to put Mispa down. They were too far from Italy to nurse a half-controlled, drag-soaked wreck all the way home with any confidence. Yugoslavia lay beneath and ahead, a landscape of hills, rivers, and partisan-held pockets. There were emergency strips, crude fields used by rescue flights, and special ops. But finding one with no charts on the panel, no clear nav instruments, and a nose full of wind was a tall order. "Navigator's dead," Malloy reminded them quietly. I can give approximate heading off the radio compass, but that's it. South by southwest, Swanson ordered. We find a river, we follow it, we look for a field big enough and straight enough to die gracefully on. Carter let out a strangled laugh. Comforting thought, Skipper. Another bump of turbulence rocked them. The nose wanted to pitch up again as the airstream changed. Carter arched his back and hauled against the belted cable, groaning. "You need a spell?" Swanson asked. A pause. "No," Carter said, "but I'm going to feel this in the next life." At roughly the 10-minute mark, though no one in Mispa could have told you the exact time with any certainty, the worst of the sheer terror ebbed. The jury-rigged cable setup had proven it could hold. They had descended a few thousand feet into slightly thicker air. The engines, by some miracle, continued to run evenly. Swanson began experimenting with trimming. One hand on the rickety elevator cable harness, he reached down with the other to the intact trim wheels on the sidewall. A few cautious turns nose down reduced the constant load Carter had to fight. "Little better," the engineer grunted. "Keep going." Bit by bit, they transferred some of the brute force onto the B-17's own auxiliary systems. No one would have certified the setup. But it meant the men on the cables weren't doing all the work. They didn't stop hauling. They couldn't. But the effort shifted from impossible to barely sustainable. "Okay," Swanson said at last, voice flat, exhausted but controlled. "We're not falling out of the sky. Now we figure out where we can crash without anyone shooting at us when we crawl out." Hours later, they would say it had been about 10 minutes on bare cables. In truth, it might have been 12 or 8. In crises that intense, time distorts. But those first 10 minutes, through the flak, through the stall scare, through the raw improvisation, were the fulcrum. If anything had failed in that window, there would have been a column of smoke rising from a Hungarian field and 10 more names on the casualty list. Instead, there was a maimed bomber, a cockpit full of blood and frozen breath, and a crew who had just proven that you could, in fact, fly a flying fortress by its tendons. Now they had to find a way to land it. They didn't make it back to Sterparone. The wounded Mispa simply didn't have that much luck left. An hour later, each minute earned with stripped gloves and burning muscles, they found a river snaking south through rolling country and followed it, descending in ragged steps. At around 8,000 feet, the ground detail sharpened. Fields, dirt roads, a small cluster of buildings with a rough strip nearby, pitted and uneven but long enough. A partisan emergency field, though they didn't know it then. Swanson made the decision in a breath. This is it. We're not going to find anything better before something quits. They briefed the crew quickly, waist gunners and tail gunner to crash positions, radio operator tightly strapped in, no one at the mortally wounded nose. There was nowhere to be. "Gear?" Burnt asked. Swanson weighed the risk. Extending the landing gear on a battered airframe could rip it off or destabilize them. But trying to belly land a B-17 with its nose gone meant plowing that open front straight into the dirt. "Drop the mains," he said. "Leave the nose wheel up. It doesn't have a home anymore anyway." Hydraulic pressure held. The main gear clunked down and locked. "Flaps?" "Half," he ordered. Enough to get some lift without asking the jury-rigged elevator control for miracles. The approach was like flying a battering ram on the edge of a knife. No airspeed, no reliable altitude readings, only eyeball, experience, and the feel of the wing. Swanson lined up on the rough strip, the jagged mouth of the nose pointed at the far threshold. "Easy," he murmured, as much to the airplane as to himself. "Come on, girl. One more favor." Carter and Burnt worked the cables like a pair of draft horses, holding the nose from dropping too far while allowing just enough sink. Wind tore through the opening, flicking dust and debris into the cockpit as they skimmed over a line of screen at the strip's end. Then the main wheels hit. The jolt snapped teeth together and threw everyone forward against belts and improvised straps. The B-17's damaged structure groaned. For a 6-second, Swanson thought the gear would shear or a wing would dig in. But the mains held. They thundered down the strip, tail yawing as the rudder fought for authority through the turbulent slipstream. Swanson kept the battered bird as straight as he could, with boots and whatever influence he had over the rudder cables. As speed bled off, the heavy tail wanted to drop first. The nose, light and open, stayed unnaturally high. They rolled to a juddering, uneven stop, left wing dropping slightly as a tire blew. Dust billowed around them. Silence followed, a crushing, ringing silence after hours of engines, flak, and screaming wind. "Everybody okay?" Swanson asked, voice raw. One by one, voices crackled back over the interphone, bruised, cut, frostbitten around exposed skin, but alive. Except Dudley and Henderson, whose positions had simply ceased to exist. They evacuated the aircraft fast, not because fire threatened, it didn't, but because no one trusted the tortured airframe to keep its grudging hold on the ground forever. Standing in the dirt beside what was left of Mispa, they finally saw her as others would. From the cockpit forward, she was gone. The B-17's iconic nose was missing, replaced by a gaping wound framed by twisted spars and wiring. You could see pilot and co-pilot seats, still bolted to the deck, perched right at the edge of that void. Control cables ran down from them into the belly, some wrapped in torn belts and improvised knots. Someone took a photograph, then another. Months later, those black and white images would circulate through 15th Air Force briefings and training rooms. Mispa, or Mispa, the headless fortress that somehow made it home on muscle and stubbornness. Proof of both the B-17's ruggedness and the creativity of its crews. The official reports called it an extraordinary case of air discipline and improvisation. Medals followed. Distinguished flying crosses for Swanson and key crewmen, air medals, citations for the dead. In the mess tent, the story grew in the telling. 10 minutes on bare cables became 15. The flak grew heavier, the stall closer. That's how combat stories work. They stretch, but their core remains. For the men who had felt the cables bite into their palms and forearms, however, the memory stayed brutally precise. The feel of steel cutting through glove and skin. The sound of the wind screaming through a hole where your friends used to sit. The awareness that a single broken cable strand would mean the end. The airframe itself never flew again. Mispa was written off, stripped for parts, and eventually scrapped. Bits of her may have flown on other fortresses, anonymous but carrying a story in their rivet lines. After the war, Swanson went home, to Minnesota, to quieter skies. Decades later, in a museum or an air show, he might stand under the glazed nose of a restored B-17 and look up at the neat, intact bombardier's station. Visitors would file past storyboards about missions, flak, and losses. Some panels would mention extraordinary survivals, fortresses that came home with tails shredded, with wings half shot away, with huge holes in their sides. Every now and then, there'd be a faded photograph of a B-17 with no nose at all, crew standing in front of the wound. A caption might read, "Crew flew for 10 minutes controlling aircraft by pulling on exposed control cables, landed safely." Most viewers would shake their heads and move on, filing it mentally under war miracles. But in the mind of the man who'd sat in that left seat, with nothing between him and the Hungarian sky but empty air and steel tendons, it wasn't a miracle. It was a brutal, improvised answer to a problem no manual had anticipated. In every war, machines fail in ways designers never expected. And in every war, men at the sharp end look at what's left in their hands, the scrap, the cables, the torn metal, and decide to try anyway. Sometimes those impossible minutes are the only reason anyone lives to tell the story. Mispa's 10 minutes on bare cables became one of those quiet legends, proof that courage is not always about charging forward, guns blazing. Sometimes it is about hanging on, literally, with everything you have, while the world tries to tear your hands away. And about a crew who, when their bomber lost its entire face, refused to let go of its heart.